In a glass case at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford lies a small, four-sided clay prism, about the size of a brick, covered in tiny cuneiform impressions. It is called the Weld-Blundell prism. It was made in Sumer around 4,000 years ago by a scribe whose name we will never know, and on its four faces, in patient orderly columns, it lists the kings of Sumer. But the list does not begin where modern history begins. It begins long before. The first 8 kings on the list, the antediluvian kings, are said to have reigned for 200 years. Between them, the very first of them, Alulim of Eridu, ruled, the text says, for 28,800 years. Then, in the middle of the text, in one short line, the scribe writes a sentence that breaks the history of the world in two, until, eventually, the reigns settle into the lengths we recognize. So who were those 8 kings before the flood? What kind of beings could rule for tens of thousands of years? And why did one Sumerian scribe 4,000 years ago write them down as if they were real? Tonight we are going to walk into that question slowly. We are not going to argue about it. We are going to look at the prism. We are going to read the names. We are going to consider, calmly, what mainstream Sumerologists say it means, and what the unorthodox traditions say it means, and we are going to let both possibilities sit beside each other in the dim light of an English museum case. So settle in. Lay your shoulders down. Let your jaw soften. The room you're in is warm, and the night ahead is long, and there is nothing you need to do for the next half hour except listen to a story about a piece of fired clay that has been sitting on a shelf somewhere for 40 centuries and which still has not been fully understood. The scribe finished his work, packed away his reed stylus, and went home. To understand the Sumerian king list, we have to spend a moment thinking about how a Sumerian scribe actually worked. The list was not written on parchment, nor on papyrus, nor on stone. It was written on damp clay, with a small reed stylus, by a man who had spent years of his childhood learning the craft. In the cities of Sumer, in the centuries before 2000 before the Common Era, every major town had what we would now call a scribal school. Boys would enter at perhaps 8 or 10 years of age, and they would sit on low benches in shaded courtyards, and they would copy. The Sumerian education was, in essence, the education of the list. The clay itself came from the river banks of the Euphrates and the Tigris. While it was still damp, the scribe pressed his 3-edged stylus into the surface, leaving the small wedge-shaped marks we now call cuneiform. For more durable copies, the tablet would be baked in a clay oven, becoming, in effect, a small ceramic plaque that could survive almost anything. The Weld-Blundell prism we are concerned with tonight is not a tablet at all. It is a 4-sided clay column with carefully prepared faces, designed to display the entire king list on a single object. It was probably made in the city of Larsa, around the early 2nd millennium before the Common Era. It was acquired in 1922 by Herbert Weld-Blundell, a British amateur archaeologist, and donated to the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, where it sits today. Multiple copies of the king list exist. Some are full prisms like Weld-Blundell, others are partial tablets, fragments, scraps. They were copied and recopied across centuries in different cities by different scribes. The text we have is a composite reconstructed by modern Sumerologists from those many overlapping sources. So when we talk about the Sumerian king list, we are talking about a tradition, a long, patient tradition of careful Sumerian scribes copying out the same names and the same numbers, generation after generation, by lamplight on small tablets of damp clay in the cool evenings of cities that no longer exist. The first king on the list is named Alulim. The list says he reigned in the city of Eridu, and Eridu, by all the archaeology we have, was the oldest city in the world. Eridu sits today as a low mound in the southern Iraqi desert, about 12 miles south of the modern town of Nasiriyah. Walk out across the sand, and you will not find much. The faint outline of an old terrace, wind and dust and silence. But beneath your feet, layer upon layer of human habitation goes down, almost 20 meters deep, and the bottom layer dates to at least 5,400 years before the Common Era. Before there were Greeks, before there were Hebrews, Eridu was already old. The Sumerians themselves believed that kingship had descended from heaven and had landed first at Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He reigned 28,800 years. 28,800 years. That is the number written in neat cuneiform on the prism in Oxford. It is a longer span of time than the entire archaeological history of the modern human species. It is, by any honest reckoning, an impossible number. And yet, when you stand on the mound at Eridu, with the wind coming up from the south, and the date palms shimmering in the heat, and the sky bleached white at noon, 50 centuries ago, look back even then at something that they could not quite see. Alulim is followed, on the list, by Alaungar, then to Shuruppak. Each city held the divine office for 1 or 2 reigns, and then it passed on, like a lamp being carried from house to house in the dark. The names of these 8 kings, and the numbers attached to them, sit at the heart of the puzzle we are going to spend the rest of the night with. Let us, gently, list them. Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years. Alaungar of Eridu, 36,000 years. Then kingship passes north to the city of Bad Tibira. Enmenlu-Ana of Bad Tibira. Enmen-Galana of Bad Tibira, 28,800 years. Dumuzid the shepherd of Bad Tibira, 36,000 years. Then kingship moves on to a smaller town called Larak. En-Sepad-Zidana of Larak, 28,800 years. Then to Sippar. Enmen-Durana of Sippar, 21,000 years. And then, finally, before the flood, kingship comes to rest in the city of Shuruppak. Ubaratutu of Shuruppak, 18,600 years. Add them together, and you arrive at 241,200 years. There is one detail in those numbers that the careful eye notices. They are not random. They are all multiples of a Sumerian unit called the Sar, which corresponds to 3,600 years, and the Ner, which corresponds to 600. 28,800 is exactly 8 Sars, 36,000 is 10 Sars, 43,200 is 12 Sars. The numbers are arithmetically clean. What this tells us is that whoever composed the list, the long reigns are not arbitrary. They are following a numerical scheme anchored on the Sumerian base 60 mathematics. They mean something within the system. Whether that system is mythological, a way of expressing very long, very holy time, or whether it preserves a memory of beings who really did live for tens of thousands of years, is a question that mainstream Sumerologists and the unorthodox traditions answer in 2 completely different ways. But the names are clear, the numbers are clear, and the cities, one after another, the lamp passing from house to house, are written in patient clay on a small prism in a museum in Oxford, and have been written in the same order by Sumerian hands for 4,000 years. After the 8th king, Ubara-Tutu of Shurupak, the prism contains a single short line. It is one of the most extraordinary lines in any ancient document we possess. Written in plain Sumerian, in the same patient cuneiform as the rest of the list, it reads simply, "That is all." 8 words in our translation, a short line in their script. And the world on the prism? What follows that line is an extraordinary thing. The next entry begins after the flood had swept over, and after kingship had come down again from heaven. Kingship was at Kish. And the list resumes. New kings, new cities, new reigns, but the reigns are now shorter. The very same scribes who recorded reigns of 28,000 and 43,000 years before the flood now record reigns of 1,200 years, of 900, of 600, of 120. The numbers are still long by any normal measure, but they have changed. The order of magnitude has shifted. A flood, in other words, is not just a story in this list. It is the structural pivot of the whole document. It is the line where the kings of long ages give way to the kings of shorter ages. It is the place where, by the scribe's own reckoning, history changed character. The Sumerians had several flood traditions. The most famous comes from the Eridu Genesis, in which a king named Zuzudra is warned by the god Enki, builds a great vessel, and survives a divinely sent flood that wipes out the rest of humanity. A later Akkadian version names the same survivor Utnapishtim. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh travels to find Utnapishtim and asks him how he became immortal. Utnapishtim tells him the story of the flood. And from the Akkadian and Sumerian sources, the flood story moves westward into the Hebrew tradition, where it becomes the story of Noah. Multiple cultures, multiple languages, multiple millennia, all preserving a memory of the same event, in which an old world was washed away and a new one began. Whether the flood the Sumerians remembered was a single great event, perhaps the breaking of the post-glacial Persian Gulf basin, or whether it was a more diffuse cultural memory of repeated flooding in the Tigris-Euphrates plain, the king list is unambiguous. There was a before, and there was an after. And the kings of the before reigned in a way the kings of the after never could. That single line, "Then the flood swept over," is, in a sense, the hinge on which the whole list turns. The first king of the post-flood era is named Jushur. He ruled at Kish, the prism says, for 1,200 years. A 1,000-year reign sounds, to our ears, almost as impossible as a 30,000-year reign. But on the page of the king list, it is a sharp downward step. The first king after the flood reigns for 14,200. That is a reduction of more than 95%. The list continues. Kolasinabel of Kish, 960 years. Nangishlisma of Kish, 670 years. En-Tarahana, 420. Babum, 300. Babum, 300. Pianum. The rains drift down and they drift up again, but they stay, broadly, in the hundreds rather than the tens of thousands. The dynasty of Kish lasts for 23 kings and accumulates, the list says, a total of about 24,500 years. Then kingship moves to Iena, then to Uruk, then to Ur. New dynasties, new cities. The lamp keeps moving. Among the post-flood kings of Uruk, we find some names that we recognize from later literature. Lugalbanda is listed there. With a reign of 1,200 years, Lugalbanda is the king around whom one of the oldest Sumerian poetic cycles was composed. He is perhaps the father of Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh himself appears on the list. Gilgamesh of Uruk, son of Lugalbanda. Already by his time, the reigns are coming down to lengths that, while still longer than ours, are recognizable. Then the dynasty of Ur. Then kingship returns to Awan, then to Hamazi, then back to Uruk again. The list traces, with patient bureaucratic care, the movement of the divine office of kingship across the land of Sumer, century after century, dynasty after dynasty. By the time we reach the dynasty of Akkad, founded by Sargon around 2334 before the Common Era, we're in territory that historians can independently verify. Sargon was real. His reign, the list says, lasted 56 years. Independent records broadly agree. By the early second millennium, the list is simply history. The drift is unmistakable. The further back you go, the longer the reigns, until you cross the floodline, and the reigns become impossible. And then, by the time the king list reaches the dynasty of Akkad, the dynasty of Ur III, and the various dynasties of Isin and Larsa, we are no longer in legend. We are in well-attested ancient history. Sargon of Akkad really existed. His daughter Enheduanna was the world's first named author. Ur-Nammu of the third dynasty of Ur really existed. We have his law code, the oldest surviving in the world. And the reigns by this point have settled down. Sargon, 56 years. Naram-Sin of Akkad, 56 years. Ur-Nammu, 18 years. Shulgi, his son, 48 years. These are normal human reigns, the same length we would write of a Tudor king or an Ottoman sultan. What is striking is that the very same document, the very same prism in Oxford, written by the very same hand, gives us reigns of 28,000 years for the antediluvian kings and reigns of 50 years for the historical ones. The scribe is not on the evidence distinguishing between two registers of writing. He records both as if they were equally factual. He treats Alulim of Eridu, ruling for 28 millennia, as the same kind of entry as Naram-Sin, ruling for 56 years. They sit in the same columns. They follow the same numerical conventions. They are, on the surface of the clay, the same sort of thing. And this is what makes the list so peculiar. It is not a mythological text in the usual sense. It does not say things like, "In the time of the gods, when the world was new." It is a sober, bureaucratic, list-making document. It is the kind of thing one might expect a temple administrator to draw up for record-keeping purposes. It is in the tradition of the lexical lists, the lists of fish, the lists of professions, the lists of cods. It is, in form, a piece of administration. But its content includes reigns that no human king ever had. This is why the king list sits, even now, at the strange intersection between Sumerian mythology and Sumerian historiography. It is too tidy, too administrative, to be casually dismissed as fairy tale, and it is too internally inconsistent with what we know about human lifespan to be casually accepted as straight chronology. Modern Sumerologists, faced with this curious document, have proposed several careful explanations. The unorthodox traditions faced with the same document have proposed something quite different. We will look at both fairly in turn. The mainstream academic reading of the King List was developed in detail by the Danish-American Sumerologist Thorkild Jacobsen, whose study, the Sumerian King List, published in 1939, remains the standard reference. Jacobsen was a careful, conservative scholar. He spent his career reading cuneiform. The list, he argued, was composed in the Old Babylonian period, around the early second millennium before the Common Era, by scribes who were attempting to compile a single unified history of Sumerian kingship. The political purpose was straightforward. The Sumerian cities had spent centuries fighting each other for primacy. The list legitimized that claim by tracing the divine office of kingship through every previous city, down to Isin itself. It is, in this reading, a piece of political theology, dressed as a chronicle. The huge antediluvian rains, Jacobson suggested, are not literal. They are mythologized. The numbers are too clean, too divisible by the Sa of 3,600 years, to be records of actual lifespans. They are doing the work that exaggeration always does in ancient royal documents. They make the deep past feel weighty. They give the early kings a divine quality that the later kings do not have. Other Sumerologists have refined this view. Some have argued that the numbers may originally have been written in months, not years, and were misinterpreted by later scribes. Others have suggested that they were never meant to be added literally, and that the genre of the list is closer to liturgy than to chronicle. What unites the mainstream readings is a reluctance to take the antediluvian rains at face value. The kings in this reading are real or semi-real cultural memories, fitted into a numerological scheme that signals their special, near-divine status. The flood is a literary hinge marking the transition from sacred prehistory to historical time. This is a sober, internally consistent reading. It comes from scholars who have spent their lives reading cuneiform. It does not require us to imagine kings living for 30,000 years, and it has held the field in academic circles for the better part of a century. But it does leave some readers feeling that something has been quietly explained away, not refuted, just absorbed into a frame that makes the puzzle disappear. And it is to those readers, and what they have made of the list, that we now turn. In the unorthodox tradition, beginning most influentially with the writings of Zechariah Sitchin in the 1970s, the Sumerian king list has a quite different significance. The kings, in this reading, were not human. The reigns were not exaggerated. The reigns are simply what the text says they are. The Anunnaki in the Sumerian texts themselves are gods. They are, the texts say, the children of the high god An, and they came down from the heavens to inhabit the land. They had cities, they had temples, they had personal names. They walked, in the imagination of the Sumerians, among the people of the rivers. Sitchin's reading, controversial then and now, was that the Anunnaki should be taken literally as the long-lived rulers the king list describes. He argued, on the basis of his own reading of the cuneiform texts, that the Anunnaki were a real, advanced, biologically distinct people who had governed Sumerian cities in the deep past, and whose reigns, measured in human years, naturally produced the impossible numbers we see on the list. The flood was a real catastrophe that ended their direct rule. After the flood, kingship passed to mortal humans, who themselves still had longer than modern lifespans for several centuries before settling down. This reading is rejected by every mainstream Sumerologist. Sitchin's translations have been disputed in detail by scholars who can read cuneiform without his interpretive lens. The Anunnaki of the original Sumerian texts are clearly described as gods, in a religious sense, not as a separate biological species in any modern sense. But the reading has not gone away, in part because the king list, taken at face value, says what it says. The reigns are written down as years. The flood is written down as a real event. The transition is written down as a real event. The transition is written down as a real transition. The mainstream reading requires us to translate the text into its own terms before it makes sense. The unorthodox reading takes the text at its word, even if its word seems impossible. Graham Hancock and others have built on Sitchin's work, arguing that the list preserves a genuine memory of a vanished pre-flood civilization, whether that civilization was human or otherwise. The king list, in their reading, is the oldest piece of historical testimony we possess about a world that was lost. Whether you find this persuasive or whether you side with Jacobson and the mainstream depends on what you require from a text written 4,000 years ago. The honest position, after walking through both readings of the Sumerian king list, is that we do not know, The mainstream view that the antediluvian rains are mythologized and the document is political theology is held by serious scholars for serious reasons. The unorthodox view that the text means what it says and is preserving a memory of a pre-flood civilization is held by a smaller community of readers who are unwilling to translate the document away from its plain sense. There is perhaps a third position that does not require us to choose. The list may be a true memory, dimly remembered, deeply distorted by the 4 millennia of oral and written transmission that lay behind even the oldest copy we possess. They may have been remarkable in some way that the Sumerians no longer fully understood when they wrote the list down. The numbers may be the surviving fragment of a counting system we no longer know how to read. The truth may sit somewhere between Jacobson and Sitchin and may be unrecoverable from where we stand. What we have, in the end, is the prism. It still sits in its glass case at the Ashmolean. The clay has held its impressions for 40 centuries. The names of Alulim, Alangar, Enmen Luana, Enmen Galana, Dumuzid the Shepherd, Ensipad Zidana, Enmen Duana, Ubara Tutu are still there, in the order in which a Sumerian scribe pressed them into damp earth, and after them the line, then the flood, swept over. For tonight, let that be enough. Let us not insist on solving what cannot at present be solved. Let us hold the question in its full strangeness, and let us be content that the question itself has been quietly waiting in Oxford for over 100 years. Whatever the truth is, it has the patience of fired clay. It will be there when we wake up. Your work today is done. Let the long quiet of a desert evening carry you down into sleep, the way the cool of the Euphrates Valley once carried the scribes of Eridu and Uruk into theirs, 4,000 years ago, after the lamps had been put out and the tablets had been set on their cedar shelves to dry. Sleep well. Wherever you are in the world, thank you for letting us tell you a story. Comment your country and your time below.